Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Coldplay with God Put a Smile on Your Face. And on today's episode, I would like to talk about faces in a little bit more detail. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the faces of wasps and also of wolves. And this seems a bit random, I'm sure, but I've chosen this because there have been a couple of studies that have come out recently looking at the facial markings of these two different groups of animals. And they're quite interesting studies because they're all about communication and how the look of particular faces can signal certain things to other animals within these species. And actually both of the studies look at multiple species, but kind of focus in a little bit on gray wolves in the case of the wolf paper, and also on a particular type of paper wasp and the wasp paper. So we'll think about these things kind of generally, but then also think about these very specific cases of facial signaling. So I'm actually going to start with the wolf paper, and this is one that got a little bit of press, so you might have seen some of this in the news, but probably nothing in this much detail. I actually was really surprised when I read this paper because when I saw all the headlines, it was very focused specifically on these wolves. But actually the whole study looked at lots of different species within the canid family. So it's looking at all sorts of different dog and dog-like species out there and how they signal, or whether or not they signal, using their faces. So one little aspect of that actually has to do with wolves, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail towards the end. But just to give you a bit of background about why all of this research was conducted to begin with, I want to talk about gaze communication and kind of facial morphology. So facial morphology and coloring, especially around the eyes, is thought to serve multiple different functions in animals. So for one thing, it might camouflage the eyes so that other animals can't see where you're looking, and that's going to be quite good if you're a predator because it means that potential prey can't tell that you're watching them and potentially thinking about taking them down. Also, the coloration can highlight eyes in order to advertise watchfulness, and this is something that we see a lot in primates, in particular in humans. So for example, we have these elongated outlines, we have a large area of exposed white coloration, and this is kind of unusual in primates. You only see this in a couple of species, and it's something that allows other individuals within your group to see that you are watching them, and also to use the eyes to kind of glance around and indicate things. So if you're looking at someone and trying to say, hey, look, look to your left, look to your right, you can kind of do that by moving your eyes. And the reason we're able to do that is because we do have quite obvious pupils and irises in the middle of the eyeball, and we do have a shape that allows us to really have quite a range of eye motion that's quite obvious to observers. Now similarly, in gray wolves, previous studies have shown that the facial patterns of these animals can facilitate gaze direction. And this is not something that's commonly found in other canids, but there is this evidence in this one particular species that the morphology of the eye is something that could be quite useful in communication. And that's one of the things that interested the authors in looking at all the different canid species, to think about the different types of morphology and kind of a spectrum of eye morphology, along which there might be variations in how the eye looks and also then how the eye is used when communicating with other animals. And we do know that dogs and wolves can both follow the gazes of humans, and so we have this kind of interspecies relationship and ability to use this signal, but there haven't really been any comparative studies looking at facial color patterns and gaze signaling across all of these species within the dog family. So the current study was developed to compare facial color patterns among 25 different species of canids and focusing specifically on gaze signals. So again, this kind of eye coloration can be used in lots of different ways, but they specifically wanted to see whether these are animals that are able to use their kind of gaze, and I'm trying to think of another way to explain this. So whenever you're looking in a concentrated way at an organism or in the environment around you in order to communicate something, that's what your gaze is. So they're looking specifically at this type of behavior and not the other sorts of things that you might be able to do with your eyes. So they wanted to think about what is the function of the facial color patterns. Are gaze signaling facial color patterns, such as those found in the gray wolf, used for gaze signaling across all the different animals in this group? And if they are, then you would expect to see certain patterns of how these animals live. So animals that have features like this that allow them to communicate in this way you would typically expect to find living in group living situations, so they kind of come together as a pack, or at the very least interacting in group hunting conditions. Otherwise, why would you even have this ability to signal with your eyes if you aren't really going to use it on a regular basis? So they wanted to look at whether lifestyle choice is related to morphology. They also felt that animals that had these sorts of features should also have greater communication needs. So again, if you're an animal that's predominantly solitary, then why would you need to have all of these adaptations to allow you to communicate with other animals? You wouldn't really think that that would happen all that much. But if you are an animal that needs to coordinate, so for example, if you're going to go out hunting with a couple other individuals and you need to say, yes, you go on that side, I'll go on this side, it's time to go now, that sort of signaling, then it would be quite useful to have these sorts of features that would allow you to do that without making any noises whatsoever. So these guys who conducted the study were looking at color contrast among 5 different facial parts around the eyes, because the idea here was that the more contrast there is, the better able you are to see the eye from the rest of the face, and also to see the pupil and the iris within the eye, and therefore to see where the gaze is looking. Now they compared the gazing behaviors of species with different facial color patterns, but also different group living conditions. So they looked, for example, at a subset of all the different 25 species that they were looking at. They pulled out wolves, they pulled out fennec foxes, and also bush dogs. And these guys are kind of arranged along that spectrum of gaze use and facial morphology. So wolves have the very strong distinction where they've got the pupil position that can be seen within the eye outline, they've got the eye position that can be seen within the face, and we already know that they do quite a lot of signaling. Then you've got fennec foxes where only the eye position is clear, so you can clearly see the eyes relative to the rest of the fur on the face, but you can't really see where those eyes are looking because it's all one single dark color. And then in bush dogs, you've got both pupil and eye position being unclear because of the way that the face is colored. So everything kind of just blends in, and you can't really tell if these animals are looking at you at all. So they wanted to compare these 3 different guys kind of at different spaces along that continuum of morphology and see whether their behavioral patterns kind of matched up with their morphology. Now, because iris color could potentially have adapted for a whole other reason that has nothing to do with communication, they also wanted to investigate this strong possibility. And kind of one of the biggest theories here is that eye color is something that helps us protect ourselves against ultraviolet radiation. Actually, I don't think that's so much a theory as it's a known fact that this is something that happens. This is why in Africa, for example, you have people with much darker irises and also with much darker sclera within the eye. So this is something that is quite useful in making sure that you don't get damaged by UV radiation over time. So it's possible that animals that have different iris color, this has nothing to do with whether or not they're communicating with those different colors or lack of color, but it might have to do simply with the fact that they live at a high altitude or a low altitude, and so they are adapted to help themselves out in these extremely bright or extremely vulnerable positions. So they also wanted to look at iris color across 3 major geographic areas, the Arctic, the temperate climates, and also the subtropical areas, in order to make sure that there wasn't a clear pattern that had nothing to do with communication and had everything instead to do with location. So what were the methods used in this study? Well, the researchers collected 320 photos of adult individuals across 25 different species, and they subjected all of these photographs to a quantitative analysis using a computer. So they pulled up these images and they made them quite large, and then they highlighted various portions of the face so that they could measure how much contrast there was in the color. And this was something that they did not have to do just relying on their own eyes. They could actually use the computer to calculate these things for them. So they looked at color contrast between 5 different parts of the face: the pupil, the iris, the eyelid margin, the coat, so the fur right around the eyes, and also the rest of the facial area, including the eyes. So the rest of the facial area meaning beyond that, just around the eye bit. If you go just a bit further, all the rest of that color as well. So they then measured the luminance of each of these facial parts, assuming 2-color vision, which is what we find in the canids. So they're basically looking at the difference between dark and light, rather than looking at, very specific shade differences. And the contrasts included the one between the iris and the pupil. So they're looking here for conspicuousness of the pupil position in the eye outline. They were looking at the difference between iris and eyelid, between the coat around the eye and the eyelid, between the eye and the rest of the face, and the conspicuousness of the eye position within the face. Now they also investigated the relationship between facial color pattern and phylogeny. So phylogeny here is basically the family tree. And they want to make sure that this is not something that has, whatever patterns that they found, are simply not just showing which animals evolved a trait and then passed that trait on to all of their descendants. So you would expect, just because of the way that genes work, that all of the animals that are quite closely related would have similar eye patterns, simply because they are closely related and had some ancestor that passed the same thing on to all of them. On the other hand, if you have something that's actually specifically emerging because of the way that animals are using it, so the fact that this contrast between various facial parts is helping communication, then you would expect to see more variation even amongst really closely related animals, because that would suggest that this thing is evolving because it's being used in a very particular way by a very particular species, and it's not just by chance. So this is why they wanted to look at color patterns and phylogenies, and they used a phylogeny that had been created fairly recently using 30 of 34 living species, so it's pretty complete. And it has identified 4 different groups of animals. The first is the red fox-like clade, which contains 10 species. The second is the South American clade, which contains 4 species. The third is the wolf-like clade, which contains 10 species. And then finally there's the gray/island fox clade, which only contains 1 species. And I'm not going to go into detail about what each one of those means specifically, because it's just kind of an easy way of grouping together animals that are fairly genetically related to each other. So obviously red fox-like clade is a group of animals that are either red foxes or quite like them and are quite closely related, and so on and so on. So that's just what all of that means, because they wanted to look across those 4 different groups and see if there were kind of more similarities within them or amongst them. Now they also studied the sociality of canid species, and this was something that they did by concentrating on the social life during the non-breeding season. So we know that a lot of animals kind of alter their behaviors during the breeding season, because you have animals artificially coming together at that point so that they can mate. And a lot of animals will mate and be found together only at that time of year and then go off and be solitary again. So it's not really a good representation of what it is that they're doing most of the time. So they focused mainly on the non-breeding season, and they were looking at kind of general behavior but also hunting behavior. So first of all, they wanted to know whether these are group living species that form a family group of more than 3 individuals even during that non-breeding season, or whether it's a solo or pair living species that never really forms groups and it's just 1 or 2 animals at all times. Then they looked at the hunting behavior. So again, group forming species are ones where they have hunting parties of more than 3 individuals, and the solo and pair forming species obviously are hunting singly or in pairs. Now finally, once they kind of had the initial analysis done, they clearly found that they had these 3 basic groups along the spectrum. So the ones I mentioned earlier, your gray wolves, your fennec fox-like animals, and then your bush dogs. And so they wanted to investigate each one of these in a bit more detail in order to look more specifically at differences in their gazing behavior. So they found 11 gray wolves, 2 fennec foxes, and 4 bush dogs. And I'm pretty sure that all of these were in zoos or in other captive conditions so that they could watch them fairly easily. And they performed observations where they studied the use of gazing behavior in these organisms. And again, the gazing behavior is basically the animals are fixing their face in the direction of another individual, and they're staring at that individual for more than 1 second straight, and the rest of their whole body is kept still. So it's quite obvious that these animals are trying to signal something by staring the other animal down. And as you might expect, in association with this, they also observed face averting behaviors. And this is an interesting thing because we know that a lot of animals will directly avoid eye contact. And so if they're averting their faces, that actually gives you almost as much information as if they're staring at each other, because both of those things indicate that gaze is quite an important feature of communication in those species. So actually, if you have a dog, then you've probably noticed that it will become quite uncomfortable if you stare at it right in the eyes, and it will often look away. And that's because it hopefully perceives you as the alpha, and it feels that it's below you, subordinate to you, and so it doesn't want to challenge you inadvertently by staring you right in the face. And that's basically what they're looking for here, are these animals that can communicate that sort of hierarchy and that sort of information by staring each other down, and if so, is there kind of this facial aversion behavior as well. So that is everything that they did whenever they were performing all the observations and collecting the data, and I'm going to break right now for a bit of a song, and when I come back I'll tell you the results of their study. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Chris Thomas King with Wanna Die with a Smile on My Face. And on today's show I am talking about two different recent scientific studies looking at faces, and the first of these is a study that looked at wolves and other canids in order to see how and whether they use their eyes in order to signal things to their conspecifics. And just before the break I was talking about all the methods in the study, and now I want to look at the results. So the authors of the study were looking at various types of contrast between different features of the face, and using the different indices that they were quantifying, they could categorize three different types of faces. Now the A-type face is one in which both the pupil position and the eye outline and the eye position were conspicuous. So this is a face like ours, it's a face like the wolves that they'll go on to talk a little bit more about later. Then there's the B-type face, where only the eye position in the face was conspicuous. So basically you've got an eye that's all one color, but it's a different color from the rest of the face. So you can't see where it's looking, but you can clearly distinguish it from everything else in the face. And then they had the C-type type of face, which is where you have both the pupil and the eye position being inconspicuous. So the eye is basically all one color, and it's a similar color to the face, more or less. So you're not able to really tell where the animal is looking. Now, facial coloring and phylogeny was the next thing they looked at. So they were interested in seeing whether particular groups of animals had similar types of facial coloring, which would suggest that this was just an ancestral trait that they had that was then passed down. But if there was lots of variation, you might expect that this is a trait that could have evolved because it facilitated some sort of useful behavior in the animal's environments. And what they found was that proportion of facial color types differed significantly based on the sociality of canids during the non-breeding season. And what they found was that the A-type faces were much more common among group-living species than among solo and pair-living species. They also found that species with B-type faces tended to live in solo and pair-living conditions. And so these things taken together both suggest that there's something about that obviousness of the eye, both the pupil in the eye and the eye itself in the face. There's something about that that facilitates living in a group, or that's quite useful for living in a group, and there's something about lacking that that is either makes it difficult to live in a group, or it's just not needed under the solo conditions. Now, the four contrast indices themselves did not differ significantly depending on how animals were living. And this suggests that it's not each of those traits independently, but kind of all of those traits working together to create a certain type of face that has a cumulative effect on whether or not these traits are influencing or being influenced by life history, if that makes sense. So it's not each individual trait, but how those traits interact that seems to have a relationship with the behavior of the animals that have these features. So facial coloring and hunting. Well, the proportion of group hunting species with A-type faces was quite higher than for species with other facial types, but it wasn't significant. So they did really notice this pattern, but it wasn't one that actually approached statistical significance. And maybe that's because of how they were measuring it, or the sample size they had, or maybe it's just not a significant relationship. It's kind of hard to say. But the way that the pattern went suggested that group hunters were slightly more likely to have light-colored eyes, and this was the only particular characteristic that was really kind of a noticeable difference. So again, talking about the gray wolves, and we know a lot of wolves have those light-colored eyes, kind of like huskies do, and so there was a tendency for those group-living species to have those sorts of eyes, potentially because they are very distinguishable from the rest of the face, so maybe it does facilitate communication. And again, they did find that the proportion of solo hunting species with B-type faces was higher than for species with other face types, which again follows the patterns that we saw in the last result about group living. So what is the gazing behavior like in group living species? Well, they found that gray wolves performed gazing behaviors in a wider variety of postures than either the fennec foxes or the bush dogs. So basically twice as many postures were used, which suggests that this is a behavior that's quite important, and they're using it in multiple different ways. So maybe it has multiple different messages depending on the context and the posture. Particularly noticeable, they said, was the use of something they refer to as the pointing posture, which is where the face and the body are oriented toward the other animal, and the pointer's posture is such that the animal looks like it's about to pounce. So obviously that seems like quite a threatening sort of look from one to the other. Maybe the sort of look that you would make as kind of an alpha animal gesturing towards a beta or a gamma or so on. Gazing lasted the longest in wolves that had typical A-type faces, was intermediate in the fennec foxes, which had the B-type faces, and was shortest in the bush dogs. So again, this is exactly what you would expect if the A-type face was associated with communication and the C-type face was not. And the maximum duration time of the gray wolf gazes was 38 seconds, which actually is a really long time if you think about it. So this must be, quite intense signaling whenever it is being used by these animals. And the researchers did find that actually all three species engaged in face-averting behaviors, even though only one or two of them really seem to engage very much in kind of using gaze to provide information. So even if the gazing isn't necessarily that important to the fennec foxes or the bush dogs, they do still seem to have at least some emphasis placed on direct eye contact, otherwise they wouldn't be showing these face aversion behaviors. So maybe this is something that's left over ancestrally, or maybe it is something that is useful to these species themselves. Now they did also look at iris color and distribution, and they specifically were looking at this in wolf species because they did know that wolves were the ones that seemed to be using this behavior the most. And they didn't find any evidence that there was difference in iris color between the Arctic wolves, the Canadian wolves, and the Mexican wolves. Or in other words, the Arctic, the temperate, and the subtropical areas. So seemingly there is no effect of UV exposure. This doesn't seem to be something that's adapted to the environment so much as to the social conditions of these animals. And this is supported by the fact that there are often changes in facial patterns over time within these species. So for example, in many canid species, facial color patterns change as the animals grow. So the newborn gray wolves have dark bodies and kind of C-type faces with dark irises. But then as they get older, they get lighter coats and lighter irises. So they kind of go from a C to a B to an A-type face. But other species only go from a C to a B-type face. So this is dingoes, for example, and others never change at all. So there's quite a lot of variation that we see across the canids. There's no consistent pattern, which you would expect to find if this was associated with UV, because at all points in their lives, animals are going to be susceptible to UV. Another interesting thing is that the physiological basis of eye color hasn't yet been examined directly, but probably stems from something called pheomelanin. And this is something that determines the red or yellow irises that we see in animals, and also eumelanin, which is what determines the black or brown irises. And we do know that changes in these pigments over time may drive variations in coloring with growth, and that's potentially an area of further study in order to kind of figure out how these animals go about developing these different traits as time goes on. So, those are all the results that these guys had from their current study. What do they think that all of this means? Well, they feel that the light-colored irises, that's hard to say, in A-type faces are the most important aspect of gaze signal in the facial color patterns of canid species. So those kind of pale blue, husky-type eyes they think are really important. And this results in the high contrast between the iris and the pupil, because that makes the pupil position quite conspicuous. It's really obvious to see where the gaze is being directed. And the light-colored irises also contrast with the eye outline and also the eyelid margin. And again, this is emphasizing the contrast and facilitating gaze signaling. And this was particularly noticeable in animals that are social and also group hunting, which indicates that the trait facilitates gaze signaling among all these various group members. And the pointing behavior in particular is something that can provide a signal even from a distance, and this is something that they frequently observed in gray wolves when they were doing their observations. And they found that On average, this kind of pointing behavior would happen for about 8 seconds per gaze. So 8 seconds again is actually a fairly long time when you're thinking about these animals just kind of running around out in the wild, and all of a sudden they stop and they're looking directly at each other for 8 seconds in a row. So clearly that's very much a message that is being transmitted from one animal to another. And again, the aversion behavior also suggests that gazing is important, and previous studies have described not just this kind of exaggerated gazing at behavior, but also an exaggerated looking away behavior to kind of overemphasize the fact that you as a subordinate are not looking at this animal that's trying to impose itself on you. So clearly these are really important behaviors amongst these animals. Now the A-type face traits appear to have evolved independently in both the wolf and the red fox-like clades. And this is kind of interesting because it suggests, you've got the same trait happening multiple times because it's useful in multiple different contexts. So the foxes are animals like the Corsac, the Arctic, and the red foxes, and these guys are either group hunting or carcass sharing, and they sometimes form small groups that share territories. And so that is why this trait has likely emerged in these animals, is that they do have times, even though they tend to be quite solitary often or just in pairs, they do have times where it's really important for them to come together, and so this kind of signaling behavior is quite useful for them. Now in wolves, 8 out of 10 species had A-type faces, and the only species that didn't were the African wild dogs and the dingoes. And I know that those guys aren't specifically wolves, but they're in that wolf-like group. So wild dogs are known to use their tails and also vocalizations for signaling during hunting. So perhaps because they have these things, the eye coloration isn't really needed. And maybe because they are out there on the savanna in glaring sunlight, those other things are much more useful, actually, than eye coloration might be. Not dissimilarly, dingoes also have quite a lot of vocalizations, so they use a lot of howling noises, and this is something similar that we see in bush dogs that have C-type faces. So all of these animals have really good alternatives to eyes in order to communicate information with their group members. So maybe the wolves have not just the vocalizations that they have, but also the eyes because of the circumstances in which they live, the lighting perhaps, the distances or lack of distance over which they might track an animal, the size of the groups. There could be lots of things that influence why it is that they have this trait when other similar animals don't. Now, what are the costs and the benefits of gaze signaling? Although A-type faces could be useful for communication with conspecifics, they also could inadvertently alert prey, which I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the show. So animals with the B-type and the C-type faces may benefit from their ability to deceive prey by obscuring their view. And this might be particularly important if you're a smaller animal that maybe has a kind of a hunting style that's different from the wolves. So we know that wolves typically will kind of run out their prey, and they'll follow them for quite a long time and run after them until they're tired and they are finally cornered. So maybe these smaller animals are not doing that same sort of hunting. Maybe they need to find prey that's a bit closer, have a quick pounce, and then they've got it. And under those circumstances, you would think that actually, yes, you do need to be quite careful of whether or not your prey can see you looking at them. But for a wolf, it may not matter because they have all the energy to run after that thing for a long time anyway, so a couple seconds head start may not make a big difference. And that's not necessarily 100% true, but that certainly is a likely explanation for that. There are also clearly advantages to this particular trait because gaze direction can be read even in quite young wolf pups. So animals that are only 3 months old are already able to do this behavior. So clearly this is an important part of their lives. And we also know that wolves can read gazes in domestic dogs and also in humans as well as other wolves. So this is something, they can apply this to multiple different species. And particularly strong is gaze direction communication with conspecifics in wolves. So this indicates, obviously, it is the main purpose of the feature, but the fact that dogs are able to do this and are quite good at doing it with humans indicates that when we first domesticated wolves, that we may have, on purpose or not, selected for this particular trait. So we have selected for dogs that are able to read our gazes the way that their ancestral wolves would have been able to do with each other, and this is something that's become stronger and stronger over time because we have lived under these conditions together. However, it is important to note that when we've bred dogs, we've bred them for lots of other features. So at this point in time, actually, the way that their eyes look and the way that their faces look may not really be representative of anything under kind of regular natural evolutionary circumstances. So they may have kind of different eye patterns than their wolf ancestors because we have changed not just their behavior but also their morphology. But certainly we have evolved this close relationship where we are kind of able to watch each other and figure out what we're signaling just looking at our eyes. And so now what these authors are suggesting is, given all of this information that they have now about kind of the canid family and the variations of morphology and also behavior, that we might need to rethink previous studies on wolf communication in particular, as well as some of the other species that were thrown in there, and also on their morphology, because it may be that we've been missing out on some signaling that they've been using, and it may also be that we've misunderstood why it is that they've evolved certain traits that they have, because it may have a totally different function than what we may have gone in thinking. So, here we typically think of eyes as being used for seeing, but also it can turn out that they're useful in communicating things as well. So lots of different features can have multiple adaptive purposes, and so it's a good idea to perform studies like this so you can look into those things in more detail and maybe shake up your thought a little bit and find out something new. Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Dusty Springfield with See All Her Faces. And on today's show, I am talking about two recent scientific studies looking into facial morphology and its function in particular species. And before the break, I was talking about wolves, and now I want to transition into another W animal, a wasp. So on the show previously, I've talked about how male animals often have to display their quality using traits such as bright colors. In birds, we have large song repertoires, good nests, other sorts of features like that the females can use to evaluate who's a quality male, and that other males can use to evaluate who is a good rival that they maybe should avoid. And these sorts of traits are known as sexually selected signals because they can mediate these disputes between males and females of the same species, and cumulatively can facilitate reproduction. So we would expect to find this sort of trait in species such as eusocial Hymenoptera, so these are social wasps, where you have animals that have a lek mating system. And this is a system where you've got a few males that are selected out of a big group of demonstrating males by females that kind of come to sit and watch and say, all right, which one of these is most attractive? Well, he's the one I'm going to want. And most of the time, you've got a lot of the females choosing the same males because they are clearly of better quality than all the rest, and so only a few of those males are ultimately going to get any sort of mating opportunities. And so this is quite strong sexual selection, and it's posed on whatever traits it is that the ladies are looking at, because it is kind of a do or die situation. You either get the mating attempt or you don't. So it's quite important that you have what it takes to make yourself stand out. But what's interesting is that despite the fact that these are animals in which you would expect to find these sorts of traits, one has only been found in one species, and that's Polistes dominula, which is a paper wasp, in which these animals have a pair of yellow spots on the abdomen. And it allows, using this signal, the males are able to exert their dominance over each other, and also allows females to choose which male is most attractive and should be a partner. Now, paper wasps in general have striking and highly variable sexually dimorphic body coloration. So you've got the females looking quite different from the males. And this is important not only for making sure you're mating with the right sex, but also for potentially telling which member of that sex is actually the most attractive of all the ones that you've got available to you. And females are known to be able to gauge individual identity and also quality by using visual cues of the other animals signaling to them. And this suggests that overall body coloration might be used in visual communication within these species, but it hasn't really been looked at yet, and that was the purpose of this study. So the authors here wanted to look for sexually selected signals in male Polistes simillimus, or simillimus, who knows how to say these Latin names. So this is another species of paper wasp that lives in these similar circumstances, and these guys wanted to look at three likely signaling traits. The first is black pigmentation on the head. The second is another pair of abdominal spots like the ones in the other species I mentioned. And the third is body size, because usually the bigger you are, the better. And they performed behavioral observations to see whether any of those traits was associated with dominance over males, so one male dominating another, and also one male attracting a female. So kind of both of the types of relationships you would expect to have in a trait that's related to sexual selection. And then they also performed manipulation experiments to see if changing the coloration was affecting male-female interactions. So not only is this an observational study, it's also an experimental one, which is quite nice. So what did they do? Well, they collected 15 colonies of these animals from Brazil, and then they kept them in a laboratory so they could look at them under controlled circumstances. Once the adults emerged from the colonies, they were held individually in little containers so that the bees could remain virgin until the experiments. This is quite good because once a bee has experience, it can use that previous experience to influence its future decisions because it can learn. And so they wanted to make sure that these animals had no previous experience that was going to influence how they behaved, because they wanted to make sure that those interactions that they staged and that they observed, and especially the ones that they manipulated, that what they found only related to those circumstances and to not to some other behavioral variable from the past. So they looked at sexual dimorphism in the 3 focal traits. They collected multiple digital images of each of these in order to quantify the traits. So they were looking at the black pigmentation, which is kind of concentrated on the upper portion of the head. They also looked at the width and the height of the spots as well as their total area, and they kind of combined all of these measurements into a single thing that represented the size of those yellow spots. And then they also measured the maximum head width, which is something that's strongly correlated with overall body size, and it was just an easier thing to measure. And actually the reason that they did that, another reason, is that in order to get the images, once they'd finished watching these animals behaving, they pulled them out and they popped their heads off after killing them, and that's how they took the photographs. So it was easier than to just measure the head and not the whole body of the bee. I know that sounds terrible. Science is cruel sometimes. So in order to look at the relationship between morphology and dominance and mating success, they performed these trials in which they took 2 unfamiliar males and introduced them to each other and allowed them to interact. And then they also performed mating trials in which a female was simultaneously presented with 2 different males. And all of these trials took place in a glass arena where the researchers could watch the interactions and see how these animals behaved with each other. And they knew what the traits were like, and so they were able to see which animal with which trait was able to get certain types of interactions or was being dominated so that it couldn't get those interactions. Now they also, as I said, did an experimental manipulation, and this was repeated using, they used the same techniques that they used throughout the mating trials, but in this case they also altered the face coloration first. So they either used brown or black paints to cover up the natural pigmentation of a male or to enhance it. So they're making him look less or more attractive, respectively. And in the behavioral experiments, they used an observer who didn't know which males were which. So this person had no idea, so he couldn't be influenced in terms of perceiving what was happening. And what they were looking for was aggressive behavior, such as biting, darting, and mounting. And they recorded the direction and the frequency of aggression between males. So which male is the one doing all these things to the other, and how often is that happening? Now with females, the experiments were a little bit more complicated because they are actually larger and more aggressive than males typically. So they're generally in control of the mating encounters. So all that they had to do here was basically just look at which of the males the female was choosing and how often were they mating with those animals. And they then looked afterwards to ensure that the mating event had actually occurred. And you can do that because the males deposit something in the female that stays there, so it's like a little plug. And so once the female is harvested, you can actually look to see whether that happened or whether they were just kind of wrestling around in the chamber without any real reproductive activity. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Samantha Crain with Kid Face. And just before the break, I was talking about the methodology used in a recent study to look at the effects of coloration and facial coloration specifically in wasps on their encounters with individuals of the same sex and also of opposite sex. So let's look at the results of that study and see what they found about how wasp facial morphology affects their ability to communicate with conspecifics. Well, they found that there is strong sexual dimorphism in the way these animals look. So the proportion of black pigmentation on the head was influenced by sex, such that males had more and also more variable pigmentation than females. They found also that sex impacted the abdominal spots, so males had larger and more irregular abdominal spots again than the females did. And this trait, both of these traits were influenced by both body size and the interaction of body size by sex. So basically, you've got one pattern holding true for males and one pattern holding true for females because of this strong sexual dimorphism. And overall, males, as I said earlier, were significantly smaller than females. So the thing that they have that really distinguishes them is not just their smaller size, but also the larger patch of color and the more variable patch of color. And the fact that it is quite variable right away lets you know that this is something that really could signal how good these males are or how bad they are. Because if you've got a big variety, that means you probably have the range of really good to really bad. And females could then learn to use that to figure out which type of male they're interacting with. And indeed, in the dominance and choice observations, what the researchers found is that the dominance relationships among the males were always unidirectional, so you always had one that was clearly dominant over the other. But they found that they weren't associated with any of the three morphological features measured here. So the males didn't seem to be using the size, the color of the blackness, or the size and color of the yellow spots to make any decisions about how to interact with each other. But this was not the same case with the females. So when the females mated, they always did so with only one of the two males that were presented to them, and they directly avoided interactions with the other male. So they were clearly able to choose one of the two males as being more attractive than the other. And the males that were chosen consistently had bigger black spots on their faces, and also a larger yellow abdominal spots, but they didn't have larger heads. So it's particularly the coloration of both the spots and the yellow abdomen areas that seem to be quite useful in determining which male is attractive and which is not. And then they did these experimental manipulations in which they found that the males that were artificially given the higher proportions of black facial pigment were the ones that were more likely chosen by the female. So this kind of isolates that particular feature as potentially being the most important. Is it the presence of this black patch or the size of this black patch? Is it the irregularity? Something about it seems to be what the female is really keying in on to figure out which male wasp she wants to mate with in order to produce the next season's brood. So in other words, this suggests that the black facial pigmentation is a sexually selected signal. It's dimorphic. You have it in males more than in females. It impacted female choice during the observations, and it also impacted the female choice during the manipulations. So these are three really good pieces of evidence that it is a really important trait, and that the females are using this to evaluate the males using their faces. But interestingly, you didn't see this same sort of thing happening between the males. Now, it was quite unusual that there was such a strong negative correlation between the black pigmentation and the body size, because normally we find that something that indicates quality, which the black facial markings seemed to do, is also in line with body size, because generally the bigger your body, the better you are. So perhaps the two signals are conveying different information of some sort. Perhaps in order to put that much into the pigmentation, you have lost energy needed to grow. Who knows what's going on? That's something else that the authors could look at in the future. They think that it's likely that females are evaluating both the yellow spots and the black facial coloration when they're selecting the male, but again, they're not 100% sure because they didn't actually experimentally manipulate the yellow spots as well as the black. So maybe that's another thing they could do as well to really see how that variation affects the choice process. Now, these females store sperm over the winter before they produce young in the spring, so it is quite important for them to choose a good male that has good sperm and good genes that will last all that time. So this choice process is actually quite important. And this is kind of an interesting system in which to study this, because we know that wasps have very good eyesight, so it's not really surprising that they would use visual signals. But this is kind of interesting because we typically think of these sorts of animals as using mostly cuticular hydrocarbons and other types of chemical signals in order to communicate with each other. And we know that some bees have a waggle dance, so we see that in honeybees, for example, So that is an example of a visual signal that's being used by bees. But typically we tend to focus on these little scent trails that they leave for each other and the sniffing that they do at each other using their antennae. So it's quite interesting here that this is a really good example of animals using their eyesight not just to find food out in the wild, but to find and select mates. So that is all I have to say about faces this week, and unfortunately I've taken it right to the wire, so I've not got time for a song, but I'll have plenty next week.